Excluded from the presidential debates, ignored by the US media. How can US voters make an informed choice for president when most aren't even aware who's on the ballot? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. They may be running for the presidency of the United States, but most Americans wouldn't recognize them. They're amongst the so-called third-party candidates running in this presidential election, representing the Libertarian and Green parties. Routinely ignored by both of the two dominant parties and the US media, they nevertheless appear on enough ballots to win, in theory, the all-important 270 electoral college votes needed to become president. And there are many more presidential candidates who also appear on many ballots around the US. However, in the country that's often claimed to be the greatest democracy in the world, they're all excluded from all of the televised presidential debates. Al Jazeera, though, will broadcast their alternative debate from Chicago next Tuesday. This week, Green Party candidate Jill Stein, along with her running mate Sherry Honkler, were arrested while protesting their exclusion outside Hofstra University, the location of the second debate between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. It's become clear over the course of the election campaign that from the deficit to foreign policy, Obama and Romney share the same fundamental ideological framework. So what sort of choice are US voters being given as they vote in November? Earlier, Jill Stein spoke to me from Seattle. I first asked her about her arrest.
My running mate and I went to the debate site at Hofstra University, and we were trying to go in the main entrance off of the public roadways into the university for the purpose of participating in the debate. We were stopped, and we explained that we are on the ballot for 85% of voters, that Americans are clamoring for choices in this debate. 1 out of every 2 voters is now said to be staying home because they do not believe that either Barack Obama or Mitt Romney represent them. So we explained our case. They said they understood, but that they were doing their job. And we continued to try to press in. And that went on for maybe 5 minutes or so. And then we were basically taken into custody and handcuffed, taken to a secret location, an undisclosed location that had clearly been prepared for mass arrests. And at that point, we were in very tight plastic restraints from the moment we were arrested. At that point, we were then further tethered to the metal chairs that we were to sit on for most of the next 8 hours.
Despite the absence of third parties, though, the ensuing coverage of the debate suggested it was very lively and unpredictable. Do you feel that the electorate was well served by what transpired on Tuesday night?
No, and of course the media is, always ready to congratulate itself on doing a great job. But from what I'm hearing out on the street from everyday people, they didn't hear real answers about how these jobs are going to be created. They didn't hear about the Wall Street bailouts that are continuing to the tune of many trillions of dollars, actually far worse under Barack Obama than it was under George Bush. They didn't hear about the free trade agreements that continue to offshore our jobs, undermine wages, and actually undermine American sovereignty. They didn't hear about the expanding wars that have actually caused enormous blowback across the Middle East and beyond, and which are essentially doomed to failure, as we're seeing now in Afghanistan, where American troops are being shot at by the very troops they're supposed to be training. We didn't hear about the dismantling of our civil liberties, and we heard a great cheerleading session for fossil fuels without any discussion, of the devastating crisis, which is unrolling full force right now, with the last 12 months having been the warmest on record, 60% of the United States in protracted drought, the worst fires here ever on record, and all of this happening with a mere 1 degree centigrade of temperature rise, yet we are on track now for 6 degrees this century alone. We didn't hear a real accounting of the price that we are paying for the hijack of our democracy by these two political parties, and in particular, the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is really a mockery of a debate commission, which exists for the purpose of basically shutting down debate, and they did that very effectively.
That is interesting, though. In the past, you get the sense that third-party candidates have influenced the electoral agenda, at least. However, you know, you have the green ticket now across the country on the ballot, and yet President Obama doesn't seem too concerned. It doesn't seem to be on the agenda, climate change, for example. In fact, he seemed to be competing with Mitt Romney on who loved fossil fuels more. Why do you think the third parties don't seem to be even having an effect on the overall agenda of what's being discussed?
Exactly. You know, not on climate, not on job creation, because the American people over and over in poll after poll say that they want actual job creation, not just more tax breaks for the wealthy. The American people want to bring the troops home from Afghanistan and Iraq and want to downsize the military, yet we're only seeing a charge in the opposite direction. The American public wants a healthcare system that provides healthcare as a human right, like just about every other developed country around the world provides, and can do at half the cost per person of what we're paying now. All of these things are things that the American public is clamoring for. And this is exactly why the Democrat and Republican parties feel they must control the microphone, because the American public is already there. If they learn that they actually have a candidate that supports these solutions that people desperately need right now, all bets are off on what the impact might be in this election and beyond this election.
So, why are third parties excluded from the official presidential debates and mainstream coverage? To discuss this, we're joined from New York by George Farrah. He's the executive director of Open Debates, a non-profit organization working to reform the presidential debates. From Charlottesville, Virginia, we have David Swanson. He's the former press secretary for the Dennis Kucinich 2004 presidential campaign. And here in the studio, Christina Tobin. She's the founder and chair of the Free and Equal Elections Foundation. David Swanson, let me put that question to you about the debate on Tuesday. Dan Rather, the legendary anchorman of the US, said it was the best presidential debate in the history of presidential debates. I mean, do you think the electorate was well served?
Absolutely not. The majority of Americans are incredibly ignorant about what our government is doing, about solutions that are available, and in the majority of states, the majority of people will see names on the ballot and have never heard them before, will have no idea what these choices are for president. I think Jill Stein makes her case very, very well. If the proposals she's offering to cut military spending, to tax corporations and billionaires to invest in green energy and education were made clear to people, all bets indeed would be off. This was not a debate. This was a rehearsed, staged performance by a pair of parties largely cooperating on the agenda of presenting the simulation of a debate.
George Farrah, it hasn't always been like this. Can you very briefly give us that potted history of the debate process and how it ended up into a bit of a stitch-up between the Republicans and Democrats?
From 1976 until 1984, the Nonpartisan League of Women Voters hosted our presidential debates, and they did an absolutely fantastic job. In 1980, they insisted on the inclusion of a popular independent candidate, John B. Anderson. In 1984, they refused to allow the Republican and Democratic nominees to select all the moderators, and it's precisely because the League was such a fiercely independent organization that had the courage to resist the demands of the Republican and Democratic nominees that the two parties got together and ratified an agreement to, quote, take over the presidential debates. And they created something called the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is a private corporation largely financed by Anheuser-Busch and other major businesses with regulatory interests before Washington. And every 4 years, that corporation allows the Republican and Democratic campaigns to draft a secret contract that dictates many of the terms of the debates and presumptively excludes all third-party voices.
George, very briefly, though, I mean, historically, though, third parties have had a huge impact on American politics, particularly in the realms of the social safety net and rights and so forth.
Absolutely. Third parties have raised critical issues that have broken the bipartisan silence from the history, the onset of our nation. Third parties were responsible for the establishment of Social Security, the abolition of slavery, women's right to vote, unemployment compensation, public schools, public power, child labor laws. The list goes on and on. And when you exclude third-party voices that the vast majority of the American people want to see in these presidential debates, you're preventing these third-party voices that are backed by millions of voters from penetrating and removing the limitations on the actual discourse and political process that we see today.
Christina Tobin, though, the argument from the mainstream is, look, there's simply no time to hear all of these third-party, so-called third-party candidates. We know in the end, we're just being realistic, it's going to be a race between the Republicans and Democrats. Let's cut to the core.
Well, the money in politics is a problem. The money in media is a problem. Parties derived from the creation of the Australian ballot back in 1890. And then you have the FECA, the Federal Election Commission Act of 1974. These are the two lifelines of the two-party system. We've had a two-party stranglehold of the system since, well, over a century now. And here at Free and Equal Elections, and working with great gentlemen like these today, and I'm humbled to be here today, we're here to open the elections, to open the debates, to implement true electoral reform, and to shift the power back to the people, to the origins of the Constitution, which doesn't even mention parties.
Right, but before we get on to wider electoral reform, though, I mean, as far as the debates are concerned, the Commission on Presidential Debates has established these conditions to determine who gets to participate. First, the candidate must be constitutionally eligible, at least 35 years old, a natural-born citizen, and a 14-year US resident. Ballot access, the candidate's name must appear on enough state ballots to have a chance at the presidency. And then finally, there's electoral support. The candidate must show that he or she can garner at least 15% of the electorate. And according to the Commission, this is determined by an average of 5 national organizations using data obtained near the time of the debate. I suppose what's so interesting about that, David Swanson, is that you have to have 15% polling nationally, and yet the Federal Election Commission will grant matching federal funds if you achieve 5% of the vote. So I mean, that's quite kind of a discrepancy, isn't it?
Well, there are all kinds of discrepancies here, and it's also sort of upside down in that polling on name recognition and polling on support from voters is a function of media coverage, which in today's corrupted system, as Christina noted, is a function of purchasing of ads to sell campaigns on our airwaves. And candidates who choose not to sell out to the oligarchs and to the corporate powers of our country simply do not have the money to participate in this media system, do not have the name recognition. But there is plenty of time on airwaves that technically belong to us and have been given away to this handful of corporations to be resold to our candidates, to put every candidate who's on the ballots in those states who meets those qualifications on the air, let people know about them, and then take a poll. Polling is a reflection of what people have been told on their televisions.
But as far as the fundamental framework that both the Democrats and the Republicans do seem to share, David, clearly that's partly to do with the democratic processes within the parties themselves, and you're no stranger to that, having worked for Dennis Kucinich, I suppose. I mean, we're told actually as we speak that the 1972 presidential nominee for the Democrats, George McGovern, is close to death as we speak. But do you think the Democrats will ever have a progressive candidate in the McGovern mold again, then, as things stand?
It's certainly possible, but it will take the sort of reforms that would allow a third party or an independent party-free candidate to compete. Because currently, whether you're competing within the Republican Party, and then you saw these primaries in which Romney spent the most money and came out on top, or in the Democratic Party, you have to be able to play the money game. You have to be able to conform your policy positions to those of the corporate media. Here we have the vast majority of Americans on any number of issues, such as Afghanistan, wanting out, and all of these candidates who are permitted, who are considered viable and plausible and serious by the corporate media, want to stay in for more years. You have to shift your viewpoint, even if it matches up with 80% of the country, to match up with that of NBC and GE and Viacom and the rest of these media operations, if you want to participate. And that's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But if you get the money out, if you open up the ballots, if you have verifiable vote counting, if you admit candidates candidates to debates and into media coverage, then you open it up for candidates within and without of these parties.
But Christina, I mean, Ron Paul, for example, within the Republican Party, did seem to shake things up within the system there. So again, isn't there that potential within the two-party system then for fundamental change?
Absolutely not. There's a reason the Constitution doesn't mention parties nor corporations, and our forefathers, well, Madison said, parties are evil. I do see a shift. I see people arising to the surface, individuals across the spectrum uniting, across the spectrum in 2013 to run for office for 2014. The state, congressional races, as Ron Paul has taught us, is key. And Ron Paul, he has taught us about the Federal Reserve. Most people knew nothing. They never even knew the Federal Reserve existed. And so the money in politics, the money in media, Democrats and Republicans alike, tied to the central banks, tied to the Federal Reserve, we have to shift the power back to the people, and we will, starting with opening the debates.
Well, it's interesting, though, when the electorate is asked whether they want a third party, they do say they want a third party. Here's a poll that was conducted at the beginning of this year. It found that nearly half of Americans believe it's time for the creation of a major third party. 68% of those surveyed said they would definitely vote for or consider voting for a third party candidate that they agreed with on most issues. Only 28% said they definitely would not. But George, having said that, though, do we really see this groundswell calling for change right now? I mean, the sort of hatred you see for people who have attempted, Ralph Nader comes to mind, to challenge the system is enormous from perfectly, sort of rather passive, nice, liberal Democrats. When you talk about Ralph Nader, they go nuts. I mean, is there really that passion for a third party, or is it a great deal of hostility?
I think it's extraordinarily difficult. For the electorate right now is more ripe for the emergence of a third party than probably any other time in the last 100 years. For the first time during that last century, 40% of the country describes itself as independents. In other words, the two major parties have shed millions and millions of supporters who are yearning for some sort of alternative to emerge and capture their imagination. That being said, there are overwhelming structural barriers that make it punishing for third-party candidates to compete in this arena, whether it's scant media coverage or massive financial disparities or Herculean ballot access initiatives, and of course the exclusionary presidential debate process. It relegates them to marginality. And when they are marginal candidates, at least perceived that way by the mainstream press and most voters, then the only tagline associated with those candidates often is a potential spoiler. So unless we actually open up the process and make necessary reforms to allow third parties to compete honestly, they're going to constantly be denigrated as potential spoilers for the two only viable candidates.
Given the hurdles there, it particularly makes the achievement of some of the presidential candidates in this race particularly impressive. The Libertarian Party's candidate, Gary Johnson, will be on the ballot in 48 states, as well as the District of Columbia, all but Oklahoma and Michigan. And there's some speculation that there might have been some funny business in Michigan. But the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, is on the ballot in 37 states and D.C. The Constitution Party's Virgil Goode is on the ballot in 26 states and D.C. Rocky Anderson of the Justice Party is on the ballot in 15 states and D.C. Christina, you've been a ballot access coordinator for several parties over the years. I mean, what are the hurdles? How difficult is it to get on the ballot?
I have a petitioning. It's astronomical. George is right. The creation of the ballot access barriers, again, from the Australian ballot back in the 1890s, has really helped the life of the two-party system. I worked as the national ballot access coordinator for Ralph Nader in 2008 and oversaw on the ground gathering signatures 50 states, and we got them on the ballot in 45 states plus D.C. It's very challenging, and I do it for Ron Paul too. Free and equal elections, we've been endorsed by Ron Paul, Ralph Nader. Ron Paul said in 2008 to us directly, the #1 reason he did not run as a third-party candidate was because of the restrictive ballot access barriers. Who have created these laws? The two-party system.
But I mean, so what is the alternative then? Let's look for solutions,
Yes.
David or Christina. I mean, all of you really. How can we make the system more representative? What are you calling for? David, first of all.
Well, I don't think we're going to fix it from within a party, as Christina suggested, and we're probably not going to fix it from within the electoral system. We're going to need a massive popular movement for reforms which include changes to our electoral system, easier access to have names on the ballot, free media coverage, which eliminates the biggest expense in these billion-dollar campaigns. Banning, I would support a ban on private spending on elections, make them publicly financed, that financing that's still needed when you take our airwaves and put them to use on behalf of our system of government. And counting of ballots in a legitimate way that would allow people like Jimmy Carter, who go to places like Venezuela to observe the credibility of elections, to begin to take our elections seriously, as well as an election day holiday or an election day weekend, freedom to have the time to go and vote. There are any number of reasons why half of eligible voters are not going to be voting this year.
George, the powers ranged against such reform are so powerful, have so much money, as you've alluded to. In fact, actually, we seem to be moving further away from some of the things that David just talked about, with the Citizens United ruling on corporate powers' ability to influence elections. What hope is there?
Well, I agree with almost every single reform that David proposed, and I would like to add one other one that I think is actually tangible and may not be as difficult to achieve in light of the opposition forces, and that is, of course, reform to the presidential debate process itself. You know, if we need to break the monopoly the Commission has over this process, and unlike some of these other reforms that require statutory change in Congress and fundamental amendments to our Constitution in light of the Citizens United decision, we can break the monopoly the Commission has over our presidential debate process if we simply exert sufficient pressure over the major party candidates. Ultimately, of course, they're running for our vote, and if enough voters demand and raise their expectations and insist upon these candidates participating in debates hosted by the Free and Equal Foundation and other debates hosted by other nonpartisan organizations, we're going to see the flourishing of debates. We're going to see more inclusive debates and greater formats. You know, at a time when we're facing an unemployment crisis and complex foreign policy issues, why are we rationing debates? It doesn't make any sense.
But Christina, how do you fight against GE and the Koch brothers and all these mainstream organizations that many people feel are perfectly, justified neutral actors in the political sphere or on the social sphere?
You unite the honest media, the honest organization, the honest men here today for a national movement. And with free and equal elections, we'll be launching a nationwide database in a couple months, listing every single candidate running for office, whether with a party. I see independents, a lot of kids, the youth really coming, technology, social networking, and helping them, showing them how to win, giving them the resources to fundraise, and also having big conferences through Free and Equal. Again, we're here to build others. That's our whole, and educating people about electoral issues, instant runoff voting, proportional representation, groups like fairvote.org who are astronomical, and bringing these leaders together to discuss the real issues.
But David Swanson, though, from a progressive standpoint there, if every time there is an election, though, we get people, the progressive grandees right now from Noam Chomsky and others, and Daniel Ellsberg, Cornel West, they say, look, we know Obama's terrible. I think actually Cornel West on this show once said, Obama, disaster, Mitt Romney, catastrophe. But he nonetheless said, in the end, though, vote Obama because the specter of the Republicans is so bad. Isn't every election always going to be like that? What hope is there for change then? Because then surely the Democrats always know in the end they can count on the fear of progressives to always keep them in power or keep getting the vote, and then they don't really have to pander to them once they're in power anyway.
Well, what Ellsberg and Chomsky and gang say is not actually that. What they say is in those 10 to 12 states that make any difference whatsoever in this incredibly corrupt and antiquated system with our electoral college and winner-take-all in an entire state, do your lesser evil voting. But in 38, 40 states, vote for a legitimately good candidate that actually represents your views in order to begin to move things in a better direction.
Right, but the Democrats then know that they can count on the progressive base then to always keep them in power. So therefore, when Barack Obama, and we must remember over the last 4 years, Barack Obama reserved his greatest anger for progressives trying to push him to the left. They know that they don't really have to care.
Listen, I'm not agreeing with my friend Dan Ellsberg. I'm simply repeating what his view is, which is not simply vote for Obama everywhere. It's do it in the swing states. I think there's a need to build a popular movement around policy change, not around personalities, and that lesser evil voting is a hindrance to that at the moment.
Very briefly, actually I don't think we probably have time, but I should just actually underscore that we will be covering the third-party election debate in Chicago next Wednesday at 0100 GMT. That's Tuesday, 9 p.m. on the East Coast from Chicago. Third-party debate. David Swanson will be joining us. David, very quickly then, before we go, what can we expect? How widely do all these parties differ? Particularly on the left, I guess the Green and the Justice Party seem relatively similar, don't they?
Well, on some issues, they agree with the majority of us and oppose the candidates from the Republican and Democratic parties. They would all get out of Afghanistan. But on other issues, they are widely apart. Some of them want to invest much more heavily in our education and treat education and housing and employment at a living wage and health care as rights that should be expected by all of us, whereas others want to look into abolishing the Department of Education and abolishing some of these systems.
Right, that brings us to Gary Johnson and Virgil Good, I guess, right? I mean, well, Gary Johnson in particular, I guess, on the libertarian side for that.
Virgil Good, to his credit, says he supports Social Security. He also voted for every war dollar he could when he was my congressman, and we couldn't get him to stop. Gary Johnson is more of a libertarian.
All right, I'm going to stop you there.
But all of the...
Because we're running out of time, but we will have that debate next Tuesday, Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, GMT. Do join us for that, but that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.